Hi again. Here's a plan to test your hypothesis. You need to make a plan to test and collect quantitative data that supports your prediction, your educated guess about the reasons or the solutions to this problem. You could collect that quantitative data by going back in time and evaluating the work of others. And that's called retrospective data. Retro. Spective, looking. So looking back. Retrospective data. That can be a study that was very well done, but that you can't reproduce now, or that you don't have the time or the money to reproduce now. So you look back at their data, but their data is hampered by the fact that you didn't design it for your specific problem. And that can be a really formidable challenge to look at retrospective data. On the other hand, you could, if you had the money and resources, look at prospective data. Pro meaning out there in front. Spective meaning looking in front, looking to the future, prospective data. That is an experiment that you will do, and you get to set the variables. You get to figure out how to collect the data, and you design it so that it could be reproduced in the future by someone who had the time and energy and resources to do that for their particular problem. So let's get into a little bit more of that. When you look at your experiment coming up, you're going to be looking at what could cause and affect your problem. And then you're going to be thinking about the factors that can cause and affect that problem that are quantifiable, that can be measured and calculated and modeled. This doesn't mean that you have to be a mathematician. Temperature measurements are temperature measurements. They're just on a thermometer. It can be as simple as that. Then you need to think about dividing these measurements that you're going to take into independent and dependent variables. Independent means you can do anything you want with those variables. You can control them, or you can vary them. Things like varying variables, changeable variables, can be things like if I was going to study and try to replicate the Australian island in my lab at CCM, I might get big vats of water that look like an ocean, and I might devise big piles of soil to replicate an island and model an island. And in doing all of that modeling, I may use different temperatures of water to replicate different temperatures of the ocean. So a changeable variable could be the temperature of the ocean in my vat. A changeable variable could be the density of the foliage on my island. I could look at groups of variables as well. I could have, let me back up. I could vary those, I could change those variables, or I could control those variables. I could just have one temperature for the water in the vats. I could just have one mandate for how much foliage is on my area of island. I could control them. I could change up those variables. I could put those vats into groups. I could have a desert foliage group of vats. I could have a deciduous, which means they lose their leaves, a deciduous foliage group of vats. I could have vats with no foliage at all. Those would be controlled variables and grouped controlled variables. All right, so I hope that helps you with those differences. The big one is the dependent variable. There's generally one or maybe two or three, but there's not many dependent variables. Dependent variables react to the changes in your independent variables. For instance, the average burn rate of the foliage on the island in my vats. How long did it take to burn the entire area in my vats? The rate. Or the percent of the area that did burn. Maybe it's 50% of the island in the vat burned. Those are dependent variables that could depend on the types or the amount of foliage that I have on that island. They're dependent on that. Again, what we're up to is we're up to this section of the circle, gathering data to predict the predictions, to test the predictions. And we're coming past this area because we had designed our variables. Now we're getting ready to test them. We're putting ourselves into that mindset to test them. When you're devising the procedure and getting ready to test, and you're looking at these variables, you need to plan ahead for collecting the data well, because you don't want to just scribble it into books. It's going to be unorganized, disorganized, and you're not going to be nearly as efficient when all that data starts coming in fast. You have to design where you want to put that data first. When you use charts, and we'll use a lot of charts to collect data, you want the charts to be standardized so they're really easy and fast to look at. You're not looking around through pages trying to figure out where to put the data as you're collecting more data. And the data does come in quite fast sometimes. So generally what we're looking at is we're looking at independent variables like temperature of the water, independent variables down the column of the data. And we're looking at dependent variables, which are things like the burn rates and the burn percentages of the island across the top of the data chart. Now you may say, how am I going to remember that? It's so hard to remember. And it is a little tough to remember, especially because it's going to change when we analyze the data. But one way to remember it is that the dependent variables, the really important variables, the dependent variables, go down in the tables. All right? So you are generally, and this is what you were doing for your variables in your labs as well, you're looking at your first run of the data, then your second run of the data, and the third run of the data, like you did for your air pressure measurements. You put those so that the first run of the data, those columns go down. It's not a great mnemonic, but see if you can work on that and think about that for the pressure. For instance, I would put here, and I put in for my independent variable, I put in the location that you were at, remember? And then you recorded the pressure here, and the second reading of your pressure here, and the third reading of your pressure here. So I hope that helps you to understand a little bit more about the data that we collect. And then when we analyze the data in charts, and we will use charts to analyze data, and you know about this, you may say to yourself, well, that looks very different there because now I have to put this into a chart form. But in some ways it's the same thing because our dependent data are really important. Part of the data is still going up and down on the y-axis, and our independent data is on the x-axis. So for instance, temperature of the water would go from, let's say it'll go from 20 degrees Celsius to 22 degrees Celsius to 24 degrees Celsius and up to like 34 degrees Celsius. All right. And your dependent data is how much of the island burned when it was surrounded by water of that temperature, or what percentage of island. Maybe 10% of the island burned when it was surrounded by 22%, 22 degrees Celsius water. Maybe 50% of the island burned when there was warmer weather around the island and warmer temperatures in the ocean around the island. So I hope that helps you out a bit. Finally, we look back at the analysis of our data to determine whether or not our data supported our original hypothesis. Our original hypothesis, if we went back to it, and I should probably change up this slide to go back to it, but our original hypothesis says that if water quenches wildfires, and if there was water available for the ocean, in the ocean around the island, and the island should have frequent rain, and if Kangaroo Island burned completely in January 2020, then the island must have had drier conditions. Well, I can look at my data and say, do drier conditions on the island produce an environment that will burn very readily? I can look back and I can look at my data and see if it supports my hypothesis. Maybe it does not. And it is okay to fail in science. It is okay to fail in science because it really moves the step forward either way. You're always moving forward. You might decide to change your prediction. You might decide to change your test method. You might decide to change the way you collect data or the way you analyze data, but you keep moving forward. The scientific method is the key to climate change discussions. And this is, for instance, Hurricane Michael at landfall. In looking at climate change discussions, we have to let ourselves fail in order to move forward in understanding the science. So that's my job in this course, is to give you permission to fail and keep moving forward. Let's go on to the next lecture.